I'm Lisa Anderson. I'm a minister in the Cumberland Presbyterian denomination and a pastor of a small urban church in Memphis, Tennessee. And I am executive director of Room in the Inn Memphis that was birthed out of that small congregation about 10 years ago. We started just thinking about opportunities for outreach in our own congregation, and we had a building that we were not using to its fullest. We were a small congregation, but we had a large space, and so we were looking for ways to use that space. And at that same time, we were beginning to talk about outreach in a different way, and we were participating in some food sharing opportunities and meeting some people who were living on the street. So started asking, what is it that our congregation could do that might make some difference in these situations? And I knew about this model in Nashville for congregations to provide shelter. And 10 years ago, we welcomed 4 people into our building that first winter, and that has grown and multiplied by congregations. And we now have 55 congregations from about 14 different denominations and a Jewish synagogue and some nonprofit groups that help, and Memphis Theological Seminary also is one of our host sites. So it's really grown. It's a diverse group of folks that are providing this hospitality. And the way it works is that church congregations just bring 12 to 15 people to provide hospitality, which includes transportation to the church, a place to feel comfortable for the night. They provide dinner that is kind of sit down with the host and have conversation, very family style dinner, and a place to sleep, and then transportation back to the same location the next day. So it's a very simple model that meets a complex need here in Memphis.
Yeah, and one of the things when I first got involved with Room in the Inn and Colonial first started practicing this model, I think that my entire life as someone who's like grown up in poverty, I've always dealt with the question of space. What do we do with space, and what do we do with that extra space that we have in our home? And I feel like this is true for a lot of churches, right? That the majority of the week, a lot of churches are empty. And so what are some of the challenges that you faced as you've reached out to congregations? What's been some of the pulls and the pushbacks?
Well, I think that the very typical one is some anxiety and fear. There's a lot of unknown, a lot of stereotypes concerning the homeless population. There's, I just think that people have a fear of the unknown. And so that's usually the first hurdle, is to break down some of those stereotypes, to help the congregation understand that what Room in the Inn does well is to build relationships. And because of those relationships, some of that fear and anxiety goes away. Our staff does a really good job of orienting the guest. We do a registration and an orientation process so that they understand what to expect and what is expected of them. So there's a very clear understanding between the congregation and the guests who are coming. The congregation also depends on us for some training, and we do, that ongoing to talk about the reasons that these folks are homeless, some of the challenges that they have, some of the ways that that we want to interact with them, and some of the ways that we don't. Just breaking down some of that stigma and helping people to see that they are people who have had a different experience with life than I have, and that's really the only difference between the two of us.
So a question that I would have is that afterwards, once the Room in the Inn model takes place, do you see any differences between how the church interacts with the community around it?
Absolutely. I think every pastor, I hear from pastors a lot, it's a very lay-driven program. And so pastors love it because there's not, typically, pastors have so many things going on. And so to add one more program or one more outreach is not, people aren't interested in it as much. But the way Room and Inn grows is lay people tend to have experiences with someone they know in another congregation. So they'll volunteer there, and then they go back to their own congregation and say, we can do this. The synagogue in town that joined, the first synagogue that joined us, contacted me, a 12-year-old girl at the time, she was 12, contacted me and said, I want my synagogue to do this, because she had gone with a friend to a Methodist church to help one night to host. And so as her bat mitzvah project, she convinced her synagogue to open its doors for Room and Inn, and they've been hosting now for 3 years. So that's typically the way that it grows. Somebody has the experience that this has changed me personally and the way that I see homelessness, and I want my congregation to see that. And then very regularly, pastors will then call and say, this has changed the life of my church. We've done hundreds of different outreach ministries, but this has impacted people on a personal level in ways that other things don't. And I think it is that the hospitality model. Mm-hmm. I think that we need it personally. I need to have relationships with people. I need to feel comfortable and at home with people. And when we do that together, it changes who we are. And to do that with a population that experiences so little of that in life, mm-hmm. I think that it just changes how we view our neighborhoods, and we see people differently. You don't drive down the street and see people that are experiencing homelessness and feel the same way about it.
Yeah.
Because you've heard their story, you know their names.
Yeah, and so I'm curious then, what are some of the pushbacks from the community, right? Because mm-hmm. Room and Inn invites people both within the community and outside of the community who otherwise wouldn't have shelter, to have shelter for a night or to have shelter for the winter, depending on how long that program mm-hmm. is. What have you seen be the pushbacks from the community, and then what do you see helps change those pushbacks?
Very early, when we first started, Trinity Methodist, which is in a very affluent neighborhood of Memphis, wanted to begin Room in the Inn, and they were very good neighbors, and so they went to their neighborhood association to say, this is what we're going to do, and we would like to invite other people to be part of this, and we're very excited about it. And immediately the neighborhood rallied together and said, no, this is not going to happen in our neighborhood. We don't want homeless people spending the night in our neighborhood. So it was a challenge for them. They were very determined that they were going to be part of this ministry. And so we just began a process of educating people about the program, for one thing, but also about homelessness in general. Homeless people were already spending the night in their neighborhood. They just didn't see them, partly because they didn't look, but they just didn't see them. They were already there. And so what we were able to do is to say, let's bring them inside and have an opportunity to have relationships. Then the neighborhood becomes important to those folks too, to the homeless community. This is a neighborhood who has embraced me and I care about. And so it becomes a mutual experience. And so it was a very big challenge. We had a town hall meeting and neighborhood folks came and were not very happy, but in the process of talking and answering questions and hearing from folks, all of it got resolved, and Trinity's been a host for us for 8 years now. So it's, you know, it's been, it's always interesting to watch people try to put up barriers between themselves and others. And it doesn't matter who that is. It could be any group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then see that the relationships are what tear that down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happened with the Room in the Inn. I think that the fear and the anxiety, the expectations that you're dealing with people who are disproportionately criminal, that are disproportionately sex offenders or disproportionately mentally ill, all of those things that people think about homeless people. And there are those people in each of those groups that experience homelessness, but that doesn't describe the group itself. You know, to label the entire group as those people, you know, when you start whittling away at that, the reasons that people have criminal backgrounds, you know, the reasons that they've spent time in jail are typically trespassing because they don't have anywhere to be, or, you know, all sorts of small things that end up causing them to have criminal records and to be labeled in a way that is not really who they are. It's an experience, it's a situation. It's sometimes I've met people who have these things on their record and they can't get into housing, and we'll start to really explore that. You know, well, what is this? What happened? And you know, it happened 25 years ago. And nothing has happened since then, but because it's on their record, they can't get into housing. So they continue in homelessness. And so there's some good work. There's some good groups that do work to help those folks clear their record and to, you know, make some differences. So those are things. When we first started offering hospitality, you know, I didn't know any of that. You learn that as you get to know people, and we didn't have any reason to know those things. We wanted to help, but we didn't know what things needed to be helped. So as we got to know people, those are the things that were the barriers for shelter.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people think that homeless people are criminals. I think the notion that people sometimes don't realize is that in a lot of cities and a lot of states and a lot of counties, being homeless in itself is a criminal act. Right. And so then you have the argument between a just law and an unjust law. Right. And what happens to people when they're caught in this system of unjust laws where they can't even obtain a job, obtain housing, obtain resources because they were arrested for not having a safe place to call home.
That's right.
Or, you know, things like loitering, et cetera. And so that just pushes people down this cycle of hopelessness. And so until you have something like Room in the Inn that sort of accepts you where you are, but also begins challenging social norms, you're really caught in a whirlpool that's not meant for you to get out.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to hear people talk about the first, you know, very often I will speak to a group and, well, almost every time, there'll be one person in the crowd that will say, but there are some people who just want to be homeless. You know, there are some people who choose to be homeless. And, you know, my answer is always, well, I've never met anyone. I've met now thousands of people in 10 years who have experienced homelessness. I've never met anyone who chose to be homeless. I've met a lot of people who have given up the hope that there'll ever be anything else. And that's a real difference for me. And, you know, I don't know anybody that says, oh, I love being homeless. This is my choice. This is what I want for my life. But I do know a lot of them who have given up on those of us who have some ability to make a difference in how they can live their life. You know, they've given up on the system and just say it's easier not to push back on the system. I get knocked down every time I try. So I'm tired. I'm exhausted from it. I can't do it anymore. I'm just going to, be content with where I am. So I see that a lot. But it's always interesting to me when people decide, and I think that lets us off the hook if we can say, but there are people who are choosing this. Then I don't have any responsibility. They're choosing that, and that's what they want, and they got themselves into this, or so that's an easy thing to say, but it's very complicated if you really start to talk to people. Well, sure, I wanted to get out of this, but over the last 10 years of my life, I've been pushed back down so many times that I just don't have the will for it anymore. So I think that's a real difference.
Yeah, and in the realities that some people just don't know, even if you seem well off, you don't know how quickly you are into falling into homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
That one check that will get you into homelessness, how easy some states can evict you depending on what their laws are. If you don't have access to capital and you don't have access to social capital, it's so easy for you to fall into that wave of homelessness, and it can happen within a month and then nearly become impossible to get out. And so there's a calling for churches to meet that need when possible. I think that we're the conduit for social capital. At least that's what we're supposed to be. When you are in need, the church becomes the social capital. And so I'm curious, since the church sort of serves that foundation, what have you seen happen to the homeless community during COVID-19 over the last few months?
It's been a real challenge. I just left to get back here in time for this chat. We did the first testing event for people who are experiencing homelessness. So it's the first one that's been done in Memphis, and so we did it on our parking lot, and the numbers of people that came were surprising to me. That people were really interested in their health and making sure they were okay. The city of Memphis did some really good work to get people into hotel rooms during the shelter at home order. We participated in that. We have sheltered dozens and dozens of people who are medically fragile. That was the piece that we chose to fill during this time for the city, and have spent probably $20,000 on hotel rooms since the COVID crisis started. We had a shelter, safer at home order that went into place, and the next day no one was supposed to be on the street.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty crazy. And so providers really work together, which has been a positive thing for us, is that people who provide services to homeless folks have all come together and tried to figure this out. But then, you go into a phase where we are now, where it's not safe to do what we do, which is to send groups of people into congregations that have vulnerable populations and volunteers that are working. So it's not safe for us to be doing our shelter program right now. It's very hard. So the folks that would typically depend on us for shelter are back outside again. And so finding ways, we have worked together, and we have some models that are working with hotel stays and those kinds of things. But it's a big challenge to keep them safe, to keep them informed about what's going on, to find places for them to be. And then you add on top of that some unrest in the city also. And so this has been a very vulnerable population. We feel like they're doing as well as they could do. Food sharing ministries have continued, and people have been very generous to make sure that we're able to shelter them when they're not well. So, but it is a challenge. And then this past week, the eviction moratorium was lifted, and so we're all just waiting. It's going to be it's a crisis, and it's coming, and so we expect in the winter, when we start our winter shelter season, we expect to see probably twice as many as last year, which is a challenge because, again, congregations are going to be hesitant to welcome people in during this time. Mm-hmm. So coming up with a lot of new safety measures that we haven't had before, lower numbers, we'll be able to send fewer people to each church. So it's a real challenge.
Yeah, so I can hear a congregation saying, this seems like a lot, right?
Yeah.
Or how can I do this? Or that sounds great in Memphis, but my city will never do that. What is your, not only your pushback, but your call to action, right? Because we're a faith community. Mm-hmm. Justice is supposed to be in our language anyway. And so how would you address that congregation, that individual who's saying that sounds great in Memphis, Room to End sounds great, but there's no way we could do that here?
The model for Room in the Inn is used in about 35 cities. So it does work. It works well. It works with 200 congregations in Nashville. It is probably, what I say to folks is that congregations, people of faith, people in churches want to do this. The overwhelming majority of people in congregations want to do something to make a difference for people who are homeless. I believe that. I believe that people really sincerely want to do something, and they just don't know how to do it. And so this model provides them with some sort of guidance and parameters to be able to do what they feel called to do, but don't feel safe to do. So, you're not going to take your members of your congregation and go downtown and take people into your congregation. You're not going to pick them up and people off the street that you don't know. But what Room in the Inn does is to develop this parameter for it. Everyone knows what's happening. Everyone's comfortable with it. The guests feel comfortable going to places they've not been before because it's a Room in the Inn congregation. Mm-hmm. And they know that we have a relationship with those people in the congregation, and that those volunteers understand that everyone is welcome and everyone is treated with respect, and that is a two-way respect. And so I do believe that congregations want to do it. And the only challenge is to find the people in your congregation that really want to do it. Mm-hmm. Because if you have 8 or 10 people who are interested in doing something radical, radical hospitality is not easy to sell, but until you've done it, and then people, you don't have any trouble getting volunteers because everybody wants to be involved. So it takes a core group of people who are willing to take some risk, to be a little uncomfortable, get out of that comfort zone, but you don't have to make it up. And that's, for me, that was what happened for me, is I knew about this model in Nashville. We didn't have to make this up. We didn't have to design something that was safe and successful and met the needs of ministries around Memphis. I didn't have to do that. The model was already there. And just telling the story then is, and helping people to have that experience. So really it takes just a few people. It takes one 13-year-old in a Jewish synagogue. And the people in her mom said, what do you want to do? And she said, this is my project. This is what I'm going to do. And if they let me do it for one night, then that's okay. But we need to do it the whole winter. And that congregation has just embraced this. They love it. They share it with other people. So really it takes one 13-year-old to make it happen. And she's kind of my hero. But it is possible. And I think that's the main thing, to understand that it's possible that your congregation can do something this radical.
Yeah. And it's I was struggling whether to title this conversation Radical Hospitality. So I'm like, this is just hospitality in general, right? Like the ideal that it's radical to have people who are out on the streets and you have an empty space that's sitting there the majority of the week, right, just to bring them in because you're not doing anything with the space in general. It's not really radical. It just makes sense.
Makes sense. Right.
You're already paying the rent. You're already paying for the lights. Most likely you already have the food. This is just regular hospitality.
Normal stuff.
Yeah, just regular stuff. And so I think sort of the challenges for some congregations is just to evaluate what hospitality means in their faith. How are you employing that? And hospitality hour after someone has preached is not real hospitality. That's a meet and greet. But we really need to look at our faith and see what God is calling us to understand that this isn't radical, this is normative. And I love the name Room in the Inn because it reminds us of what do we do with our space and how we utilize that space in particular. So we have about 5 minutes before we wrap up. Normally, I invite people to come in and speak, and Bill's there. Bill, do you have any questions for Lisa before we wrap up?
Yeah, so one thing that, Youth Mission Co. is trying to be really intentional about is to introduce young people not only to the symptoms that we see out there in the world, but the systems that keep perpetuating those symptoms, right? And to get into the deeper issues that lead to advocacy and policy and, core issues that really go all the way back to the foundation of the country as to how things got set up and who benefits and who doesn't, right? And we're still downstream of all of that. And we have to, be very intentional to deconstruct it all, right? So, it occurs to me that for a lot of folks, and I'm in Asheville, North Carolina, we have a Room in the Inn program in Asheville as well. And it occurs to me that there's a lot of folks in our churches for whom this is the first time that they're actually getting to connect one-on-one or, in any kind of meaningful personal way with folks who are experiencing homelessness, living in poverty, facing some obstacles that you and I are not on a day-to-day basis. Have you seen instances where a person or a church makes that transition and they start connecting the dots to systemic issues, and then their church starts addressing more of the systemic things going on in the community that cause homelessness, that cause poverty? Could you speak to that for a minute?
I think that's kind of the natural progression of things, and I think it does take some time with congregations. There's it's like a core group of people who really understand what's going on, a larger group of people who are involved and contributing and participating, but they're not looking that deeply. But those smaller groups tend to be groups who are going to come to us and say, we want to do more. This is, we love having dinner and we love providing a place to sleep, but something's got to change. And so those are the experiences, and it happens in every congregation that there is a group of people who find ways to go deeper. And it's pushed our organization to do some things, to join some advocacy groups, to have a couple of our guests be representatives in those groups so that they can speak from the perspective of homelessness to some of these systemic discussions that are happening, especially right now. And I think that it's pushed us to say, okay, hospitality is our core. That's our core mission. That is what we do. It will always be our core, but there has to be, we have to keep pushing ourselves to address these you know, generational blocks that happen in these folks that we care about, that have become part of our lives. And you know, sharing food with them is one thing, but understanding that we have to provide space for them in some of these other discussions is completely different. So I think that it pushes congregations for sure, and I think it also pushes our organization at Room in the Inn. In Memphis, we have MYCA, which is a group of congregations that are working on systemic changes in Memphis. And when I was looking at, and Room in the Inn is a partner organization of MYCA, when I was looking at the congregations that are partnered with MYCA, very many are the same congregations that are doing Room in the Inn. You know, it's that, I think it really is a bridge to that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great question. It helps me to think about ways that we're doing that.
Fantastic. And so the thing that I love to do is to send people out with a call to do more, right? To challenge what we've been doing and to challenge our thoughts and our perspectives. And so the last question that I have for you, Lisa, is what is your challenge to the congregations, to the participants who are listening and watching this video? What is your call of faith and call of action to them?
Well, I think that, you know, it really is an individual call. I think we are changed individually as we make decisions about how we experience our relationships with other people. And then that becomes a congregation of people that want to make a difference. So I often tell people, if you want to experience this in a way that I believe we're called to do in Scripture, then make a friend with someone who is experiencing poverty. You know, how many people do you know that live in poverty? And I remember a time in my life where I knew people that I knew were poor, but I had never made friends with one of them intentionally, you know, to have an intentional relationship with someone who lived in poverty. And I think that those relationships are what change us. And sometimes that happens through that group of 12 to 15 people experiencing homelessness that goes into a congregation. And for the first time, sometimes a member of that congregation has a conversation that opens them up to see, oh, these are people who are living in poverty, and I might have participated in some of the ways that have kept them living that way. And that changes who I am because I know that, because I've known this person now. I have people who will say, you know, I volunteered at Room in the Inn last night, and during dinner I was having a conversation and a guy sat down next to me, and it was a guy I went to high school with. And it rocked my world, this guy said to me. He said, I can't stop thinking about it. I can't sleep at night. And, you know, I said, well, sounds like maybe you need to have more conversation with him. You know, we were friends in high school, and, you know, to see us in such different places. And, well, maybe you're still friends and you're just in different places. So I think individually we have opportunities for making those relationships, but programs like, not just Room in the Inn, but programs like Room in the Inn that offer congregations personal interaction, not handing someone something from a counter or from across a barrier, or passing out stuff on the street even, but sit down and having real conversation changes us.